So, have you ever wondered what the inner solar system was like 4.5 billion years ago, amid of all this chaos? And then how did that evolve into what the solar system is like now? So, let's talk about it. Welcome to the cosmos. My name is Chris. Let's get started. So, what was happening in the solar system? Now, let's go back to 4.6 billion years ago, surrounded by a cloud of dust and gas, where eventually the sun was formed. And over time, as the sun's luminosity increased and gravity also increased, pretty much that cloud, formed into a disk, setting up the lanes for, planets to pretty much gather up materials. And the very first planet that was formed in this new solar system was Jupiter. Like I said, there was no other planets, just Jupiter, just sucking up all that gas. It's like a planetary vacuum where it was just eating away all that gas, swirling, and eventually forming. And eventually, over time, as the luminosity increased, it blew out the parts of that gas and kind of blew it out to the far outer reaches where it separates the rock, and then you had the gas, and then you had the frost line being blown out further on. So that separated those into lanes. And then over time, as more objects coalesced, as Jupiter had a limited time of gathering up the rest of the gases, Saturn formed. And then in the frost line, you had Uranus and Neptune. And then you have sets up with, the Kuiper Belt objects as they're coalescing up into low with some ice and rock there. And this is where you also get to the inner planets. Now, you didn't have Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars just yet. In the early solar system, you had hundreds of rocky planets, these little planetesimals. But what was actually going on in the planetesimal world where that set the chaos to begin? So, just how chaotic was the inner solar system? So, when Jupiter formed, being the first planet, and eventually all those gases, blew out further and eventually set up the courses for Saturn to be formed, Jupiter didn't have a Saturn. So Jupiter was left all alone pretty much. It can do whatever it wanted. And then, because it was going in and out of the inner solar system. But not knowing that there were hundreds of little rocky bodies, these little planetesimals orbiting around the early sun. So as they were coalescing, as Jupiter was wandering in and out, that set the solar system in chaos. And remember, this is the time we didn't have Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars just yet, because they were formed out of that debris, of that chaos. So Jupiter wandered in and out, and eventually, when Saturn grew, collecting all that dust and gas and all that stuff, Saturn's gravity pulled Jupiter where it set up a 2-in-1 gravitational resonance, where it forced the planets to change directions. Where, take for example, Planet X. So the reason why Planet X is so far out was because of Jupiter and Saturn's gravitational resonance, where that gravitational field trying to bring Jupiter back into its orbit. So the force of two gravitational resonance between the two centers of mass, pretty much with that combined, it forced Planet X to be ejected into the outer parts of the solar system. And eventually also created chaos with Uranus and Neptune to the point where they swapped orbits, not once, but multiple times. And that also created some chaos in the Kuiper Belt region. So now let's get to the chapter what happened in the inner planets, where that formed Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars. So the inner solar system at the time was very, very packed. When you had hundreds of rocky planets cramming in a very limited area between the sun and then between the asteroid belt, where you had planets between zero point 0.4 astronomical units is where Mercury sits, to about 1.5 astronomical units where Mars sits. So imagine having hundreds and hundreds of rocky planets just crammed in just one limited area, and you're having interactions between the sun's activity and you had Jupiter and Saturn's gravitational 2-in-1 resonance, where that set all these planets into turmoil to the point where they were colliding with each other, they were near missing each other, they were getting ejected, they were broken up, they were colliding with the sun, they were just fusing. It was pure chaos when they were forming. And eventually you went from hundreds of rocky planets, you had 100 rocky planets, you went down to 50. And eventually this is where you led to Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars, and just a few extra planets that were just forming at the time out of this just pieces of rock and dust that from previous rocky planets that were just got severely crushed and just chaotic. So, what was happening with the early Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars at the time they were forming? So, this is 4.5 billion years ago, we're talking. So, Mercury, let's start with Mercury. So, Mercury at the time was just bigger. It was attracted to all this dust and rock. And eventually, there was a extra inner planet that was orbiting somewhere around that limited area. And this planet was on a direct collision course with Mercury, and pretty much, let's take for example, this is Mercury. So, and this also leads to why Mercury's core takes up 85% of the volume. So, this happened because of a collision course that set Mercury into chaos. A rocky planet at a half the size of Mercury at the time, at a high rate of speed, blew off all of its crust and mantle and just ejected billions of tons of rock. And eventually, all that heavy material that set back in formed the core. And then this, what's left is an iron and nickel outer core with a iron core that takes up 85% of the volume. So early Venus had a collision course of itself too. And this is why Venus spins the other way. Venus early on had a collision course where it pretty much sideswiped Venus just like that. And now it's why Venus spins the other way. And also, Venus had a runaway greenhouse effect at the time. This is now we're going to 3.5 billion years ago. Venus had water still, but the sun's activity interacted and eventually, runaway volcanism created the runaway greenhouse effect that changed Venus forever. And pretty much that friction of all these cloud layers caused Venus to slow down, where an entire day lasts 243 Earth days. Crazy, right? So this is where we're talking about the Earth and the Moon story. So we all know that the Earth at the time was molten, and this is about 4.5 billion years ago. At the time, Earth was spinning, an entire day was about 6 hours long. You had an extra rocky planet that came from somewhere. Theory suggests maybe it came from Venus. Venus had an ancient moon, and the gravitational resonance didn't help, so it forced Theia, into a direct collision course where Theia was traveling at 20,000 miles per hour at an oblique angle of 45 degrees, and ejected a third of Earth's crust and mantle. And then, not that long after, it formed this ring of dust, these billions of tons of chunks of rock that eventually formed, and then eventually, not that long after, coalesced and formed the moon. And then the moon was only about this close to the Earth at the time, where the tidal forces on Earth were 8,000 times what it is today. And over time, like I said, the moon drifted further because the Earth is spinning. This is where we also get to Mars' story. Collision course. It was a side swipe where it encountered a Pluto-sized object that sideswiped Mars' northern hemisphere. That's why If you look at the Borealis Basin of Mars on the northern hemisphere, you can see the elevation change. It was because of that skim that Mars encountered with the Pluto-sized object. That was just a run. It was just a hit and run. It basically just like that. So those are very chaotic because you had extra rocky planets in the way between, Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars, where they said it was just a demolition derby that set all four rocky planets had their own collision courses. That's what really shaped the inner planets as we know today. And Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune had their own chaos too. Uranus, the reason why Uranus is on its side is because it collided with an Earth-sized object, and that had enough force to tip a big planet on its side, so about 98 degrees. And Jupiter just recently in 1994 had a collision course with a comet, and that's why it has a permanent black scar on it. Not clear. Oh yeah, so Saturn has its famous rings because it was born out of chaos, where an icy moon got too close to Saturn and eventually shattered, and eventually formed into the beautiful rings it has now. Neptune. I'm not sure about Neptune if it ever had a collision course. Maybe it did. I'm not sure. But Uranus and Neptune had their own chaos where they were swapping orbits, though. It was because of Jupiter and Saturn. So this is pretty much what the entire solar system was like 4.5 billion years ago. I want to say thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, keep exploring.